Welcome to the sewing tutorial for the Glaze Skirt by À la Main. The Glaze Skirt is a midi-length pencil skirt with two long front slits that elegantly reveal the legs. The skirt is designed to sit about 4 cm below the natural waist and follow the hip shape with enough ease for movement. It includes a mini-length lining for a layered look, a Grosgrain waistband which will be shaped to follow the curve of the waist perfectly, 2 top stitch front seams with slits, and a center-back closure with an invisible zip and sew-on press snap. The skirt was designed for sheer fabrics such as organza, voile, lace, or dévoré. However, this pattern also works beautifully with more structured, opaque fabrics for a tailored look. The skill level is intermediate. You will be using techniques such as French seams, inserting an invisible zip, top stitching, or the more unusual waistband construction. Before we get started, let's go over what you'll need. For the outer skirt, choose a woven sheer or semi-sheer fabric, a lace, or an opaque option such as wool tailoring, cotton twill, or linen. For the lining, choose a lightweight silky fabric such as cupro, viscose, acetate, or silk. You'll also need a length of petersham or grosgrain ribbon for the waistband. Choose cotton or viscose content. These respond best to heat molding. Avoid polyester grosgrain as it won't shape effectively. Widths of 12 to 25 mm are suitable. Some 1 cm wide fusing tape to stabilize the waistline. A 20 cm invisible zip. 1 small sew-on press stud or hook and eye for the waistband. Sewing thread in a color to match your fabric, plus a spool of top stitching thread in a tonal or contrast color. After cutting out your fabric, following the cutting instructions on the pattern, you will need to mark the notches and darts. I would usually snip the notches and chalk out markings, but on this delicate fabric, I'm going to show you the tailor's tack technique. Thread a contrasting color on a needle and leave 2 long tails of thread. Then, keeping your pattern pinned to the fabric, we will start with marking the dart. To do this, you will hand stitch on the dart lines, going through all the layers. After each stitch, leave a loop of thread roughly 2 to 3 cm long. Then cut the threads to open each loop. For the notches, stitch 1 stitch, then go back to create a small loop. Next, lift the paper pattern away carefully while holding the threads. Gently pull the fabric layers apart to reveal the threads between them and cut the threads in the middle. The lining fabric isn't as delicate, so I'll just snip the notches by cutting about 3 mm in the seam allowance. And I'll mark the dot with chalk on the wrong side. Choose the marking method that suits your fabric best. Next, you'll need to stabilize the waistline of the outer skirt to prevent it from stretching. You can either apply some fusing tape or sew a stay stitch at 5 mm from the edge. I'm choosing to apply a fusing tape, which I'll be ironing onto the wrong side of all pieces of the outer skirt on the waistline edge. You need to iron the tape long enough for the glue to melt and wait for it to cool down fully before moving the piece from the ironing board. Form the darts on the back panels of the outer skirt first. Fold the panel right sides together, matching the notches, and pin the dart, checking that the legs of the darts are lined up on both sides. Repeat for the second back panel. Then stitch the darts in a straight line from the notch till the dart point, starting with a few back stitches. At the point, leave long thread tails and tie them in a double knot rather than backstitching. This prevents a bulge at the tip. Remove the marking threads. Press the darts towards the side seams. Stitch the dart on the front and back lining pieces in the same way. Press the lining dots towards the center. For the front seams, I've included several finishing methods in the patterns booklet. Choose the one that best suits your fabric. For delicate, lightweight, and sheer fabric, I'll demonstrate the double fold method. For lace or heavier opaque fabrics, you can opt for a simpler open seam finish with either overlocked or bound edges. I found that overlock or zigzag works best for lace fabrics, while bound seams are perfect for wools and heavier wovens. You will find the instructions for the open seam finish in the written instruction included in your pattern. Take your front and side front panels. You can identify the front seam edge on the side panels as the one with 2 notches. On these edges, you will fold in 1 cm to the wrong side. Fold in 1 cm to the wrong side on the whole length of the seam and press with the iron to keep the fold in place. After folding the 4 front seam edges on the front and side front panels, you will close the front seams. Place the front and side front panels right sides together and pin the front seam matching the notches. You will close the seam from the waistline until the slit notch. Stitch from the waistline until the slit notch with 6 mm of seam allowance, starting and ending with some back stitches. The stitching will land within the folded allowance. Once the seam is closed, you will trim the excess folded allowance along the full length of the front seam and slit opening. Carefully trim the folded allowance right next to the stitch line. When you reach the slit notch, continue trimming the folded allowance by the same amount so you are left with 6 mm. Do the same on both sides of the seam. Press the seam allowance open. Then continue pressing along the slit opening in line with the seam, creating a 6 mm double fold. Finally, top stitch both sides of the seam and split opening at 5 mm, catching the folded seam allowance beneath. This is the result with both front seams closed and top stitched. Next, you'll close the side seams with a French seam. Place the front skirt against the back panels with wrong sides together. Pin the side seams matching the notches. Stitch with 6 mm of seam allowance, starting and ending with some back stitches. Trim away any fraying edges. Press the seam allowance open. Then fold the panels right sides together so the seam sits right on the edge of the fold. Stitch once again along the side seam with 1 cm of seam allowance to encase the raw edges. Press the seam towards the back. Next, you will close the lining side seams in the same way. Place the lining's back panels against the front with wrong sides together. Pin the side seams matching the notches. Stitch the side seams with 6 mm of seam allowance, starting and ending with some back stitches. Trim away any fraying edges. Press the seam allowance open. Then fold the panels right sides together so the seam sits right on the edge of the fold. Stitch along the side seam again with 1 cm of seam allowance to encase the raw edges. Press the seams towards the back. You will now finish the lining's hem. Press the hem allowance to the wrong side at 2.5 cm from the edge. Unfold the hem and trim the side seam allowance inside the hem to reduce bulk. Then press half of the hem allowance down to the first crease. Then fold again to create a double fold. Top stitch the hem from the right side at 1 cm from the edge. Place the lining right side against the wrong side of the outer skirt. If you're using a sheer fabric, this ensures the right side of the lining remains visible through the outer skirt. If using an opaque fabric, you may instead place the lining wrong side against the wrong side of the outer skirt, so that the right side of the lining faces inward. Either way, pin along the center back to keep the lining and outer skirt together. Run a stay stitch at 5 mm from the edge to secure both layers together. Note there is no need to backstitch a stay stitch. Now you'll close the center back with a French seam. Fold the skirt with wrong sides together and pin the center back. You want to make sure that the hem of the lining lines up perfectly on both layers. The step in the seam allowance identifies the zip end. Mark a point at 1.5 cm below the zip end. This is where your first stitch will end. Close the center back seam with 6 mm of seam allowance. Trim any fraying edges. At the top of the seam, snip the seam allowance until the end of the stitch. Press the seam allowance open. Then fold the skirt with right sides together, so the seam sits right on the edge of the fold. This time, starting at the zip end notch, stitch along the center back again with 1 cm of seam allowance to encase the raw edges. Press the seam to one side. Press the zip tape flat to open out the teeth. Using chalk, mark the top of the zip at 1 cm down from the top edge of the skirt at the center back. Draw a line 1 cm parallel to the center back edge. This is your guide for placing the zip. Place the zip right side against the right side of the skirt and place one side of the tape with the teeth facing away from the center back edge. Align the zip stopper with the top mark and pin close to the teeth. The edge of the teeth should be aligned with the chalk mark. At the zip end, line up the zip with the top of the center back seam. Using an invisible zip foot or a half foot like mine, stitch the zip right next to the teeth with 1 cm seam allowance. Unfold the teeth as you go to stitch as close to them as possible. Close the zip and place the other side of the skirt right side against the other side of the zip tape. Then open the zip and pin in place, matching the zip stopper to the top mark and the end of the zip in line with the center back seam. Stitch the other side of the zip as the first, as close to the teeth as possible. Close the zip and check that the tape doesn't show from the outside, otherwise that means that you need to stitch closer to the teeth. Press the seam and trim the excess seam allowance underneath the zip tape. Then top stitch the zip tape to the lining only, without catching the outer skirt, to encase the seam allowance. Top stitch the tape at 1 mm from the edge. Then repeat for the other side. Now that all seam allowance are hidden under the zip tape, you can leave the zip as is, but I'm going to show you a neat way of finishing the bottom of the zip. This can be helpful if your zip is longer than the required length and needs shortening. Cut the middle section of the zip. Then carefully burn the raw edges with a lighter. Fold one side of the zip tape over the teeth and stitch in place. Trim away the corner. Then fold the other side of the tape to complete the triangle. Top stitch in place. Trim away the corner. Top stitch the triangle. And that's the result. You will now make the waistband. Bring the waistline edges of the outer skirt and lining together. Pin both layers together, matching the dots, side seams, and center front. Sew a stay stitch at 5 mm from the edge to secure both layers along the full waistline. Draw a chalk line all around the waist at 1 cm from the top edge. This will be your guide for attaching the waistband. Take your waistband template pattern. If you've printed it at home and taped it together, you will need to copy it onto a single sheet of paper, as it will be used under the iron and you don't want to iron Scotch tape. You can use pattern paper or even baking paper. Copy the line in your size and all the notches. The notches indicate the center front, the front seams, the side seams, the back darts, the center backs, and on the left back, the fold point 2.5 centimeters past the center back. The waistband will be made from a single length of grosgrain, heat molded to follow the curve of the waist. It folds at the back and forms 2 layers that will encase the top edge of the skirt. The ends meet and join at the center front on the inside layer. Place the middle of the grosgrain on the center front mark, aligning the bottom edge with the line on the template. Working in small sections, shape the tape by using the heat of the iron to ease in the top edge while gently stretching the bottom edge. Allow each section to cool down for the shape to set. Use pins to keep the tape in place on the template. Fold the tape at both back edges as indicated on the template. Shape the inner layer of the tape up to the center front mark. Leave 1 cm of seam allowance beyond the center front and cut. Mark all notches onto the tape with chalk. Pin both ends of the tape right sides together at the center front and join them with 1 cm of seam allowance. Press the seam open and taper the seam allowance so they won't come out of the waistband. You will now close the top edge of the waistband. Top stitch the top edge of the waistband at 1 mm from the edge, lining up both layers of the tape. Insert the top edge of the skirt between the 2 layers of grosgrain. Align the bottom edge of the waistband with the chalk line marked earlier. Pin the tape around the waist, matching the notches to the center front seams, side seams, and darts. The right back edge of the waistband should align with the edge of the zip, and the waistband sits just above the zip stopper. On the left back, the waistband extends 2.5 centimeters beyond the center back to form an overlap. Top stitch along the bottom edge of the grosgrain at 1 mm from the edge, catching both layers and the skirt seam allowance sandwiched between them. Finally, hand stitch a small press stud or hook and eye to the waistband overlap to secure it. Mark the position for the press stud. Hand stitch the male part of the press stud on the left back and the female part of the press stud on the right back waistband. Finally, you will finish the hem of the skirt. Press the hem allowance to the wrong side at 2.5 centimeters from the edge. Then unfold the hem, press half the hem allowance down to the first crease, and fold again to create a double fold. Check that the length of the skirt matches up at the front slits. Then top stitch from the right side of the skirt at 1 centimeter from the edge. And you're done! Give the hem and the rest of the skirt a final press. That's your glaze skirt complete, with a double folded hem, clean finish front seams with top stitching, French seams on the center back and sides, the invisible zip with all seam allowance concealed, and a neat curved waistband made out of grosgrain. We'd love to see what you've made. Tag us on social media at alama_studio using the hashtag Glaze Skirt. If you have any questions about the pattern, you can find more information at alama.co.uk. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, we have more sewing guides available for the rest of Alama pattern range. Happy sewing and see you next time!